Hi. Well, I'm out here in the garden on this beautiful, warm English summer's day to introduce you to a technique called floating embroidery. Now, this is a technique which I've had lots of requests to talk about, and in particular, I use it on a motif that I call Traveller's Joy, which actually shows the fruiting body, the seeding body of the wild clematis. Just over my shoulder here on the fence is growing one of my garden clematis. And although it doesn't have quite such spectacular seeds, later in the year it will come out with these lovely fluffy seeds which seem to hover. The tails are like gossamer, they get carried away in the wind. But the wild clematis stays on its host for a long time, right into the winter, into the following spring, very often before it flies away and reseeds. So it's a beautiful technique. It can be used not just for things like the clematis, but also on passion flowers. It can be made to look literally like floating embroidery if we do it as waterweed in an underwater scene. There's lots and lots of uses for it. Even in landscapes we can find uses. So in this video, we're going to be exploring just that. We're going to explore the floating embroidery. Hope you enjoy it. Okay, well, as I'm sure many of you know, one of the things that I'm quite fascinated with at the moment is actually working my designs basically freehand, that is freehand sketching them first of all on the fabric and then building them up gradually. So I'm going to attempt to do that while we discuss the working of the floating embroidery. And that's basically what I've done in this picture. I've begun with this large feature here, the largest of the passion flowers, and here we've got floating embroidery on the grand scale. Then I've got this slightly more traditional passion flower here, and I hope you can see there's a sort of miniature version of our floating embroidery around there. And then this is the type of fellow which I'm going to demonstrate now, which is the very basic sort of straightforward and first type that we're going to look at. Of course, you don't have to work freehand like this. You can do a sketch and transfer it onto your background fabric in the same way as I've described in very many of my books and on my ebook, One Simple Stitch. But let's see if we can just do a nice organic shape like that to begin with, as a stem to support our floating embroidery. And then what we're going to need is the seed head at the centre of the piece. So just a few little circles. It looks rather like a blackberry, but we're just going to work that in first. Always nice to have a couple of little leaves, and conveniently enough, the wild clematis leaf is a pretty irregular fellow, so we can get away with really just doing a pretty basic leaf like that. And then once we've worked this central area and a little bit of stem, we're going to work our floating embroidery around it. So we need to just give ourselves a suggestion of where that outer periphery is going to be. So just a few little dots, and they will be covered up later, around the outside, just to suggest where that is going to be. It doesn't have to be terribly accurate, it's just so that we roughly know where we're going to have our floating embroidery. And then the next step will just be to work the area which the floating embroidery itself is going to cover. So here we have the nearly completed little fruiting body, the seed head, at the centre of what will be our traveller's joy. And just as we would work a little blackberry, in which case these would be the little berrylets at the centre, we work these at a slightly different angle from each other so that the light catches them and throws them up. Now of course they're going to be somewhat covered by the floating embroidery itself, but as with all things, if we don't get the core of it, the centre of it, accurate, it won't look as realistic as we ultimately want it to. So we're working in several strands of piper's silk together. That's our little seed head. So now this is where the fun of working our floating embroidery really begins. We need a pencil, not to do any more drawing, but to hold the thread here away from the background fabric. Now we're working in this case in a single strand of piper's floss silk. If you're not working in that particular medium, just use a single strand of whatever you happen to have that is the finest, and we're going to stitch from the centre just outside the little dot that we've given ourselves to suggest where the outer periphery of the motif is going to be. That little dot will get covered up by the stitching, and we're just going to take a long straight stitch over the top of the pencil, and then rather than going back into the middle again, we're going to take a tiny stitch, just a little bit left on the background fabric, bring our needle up and then stitch back into the middle of the motif. Now we don't have to be too careful about this, we can be a little bit random if we want to, we don't have to go in and out at the same point, but we're going to come out again at the core, take another stitch over our pencil and repeat the process. So a little stitch to anchor our thread at the back and then back over again, our pencil still doing the job of holding our thread away from the background fabric. Now I'm sure you're going to see, or you are seeing, what is going to happen here. We're going to eventually pull our pencil out and our embroidery threads, in this case our silk, is going to fall back against the fabric and give the impression of floating. Now you see, I'm just turning the pencil around a little bit as I work back and forth. Now obviously there is a finite amount of this turning I can do before my pencil simply won't want to turn anymore because it's holding too many stitches, and when that time comes, that's when we will withdraw it and start again. But for now I'm able to swing it around a little bit so that you can see it enables me possibly to do about a fifth, maybe not quite a quarter of the complete round before I have to withdraw my pencil. You don't have to use a pencil, of course, if you want to use something like a straw for something finer, anything really that is smooth. The thing you have to remember is that you don't want to have any rough edges on whatever your implement is, because then of course when you draw out your implement, it will catch on the silk. So let's just do that now. Let's pretend we've gone absolutely as far as we possibly can. You see it's actually holding the pencil there until I let go the tension a little bit. And so I pull the pencil out, and there is the beginning of our Traveller's Joy, the beginning of that lovely floating embroidery. So now I've worked almost all the way round our seed head in exactly the same way, over the top of the pencil outwards, little stitch at the back, and then over the top of the pencil back into that central spot. And those stitches are becoming quite crowded on the inside now, but of course on the outside they're nicely spaced as we go around. And with just a few more stitches I'm going to have completed the circle. Just a couple more, and the joy, you see, of having the pencil in the middle there is that we don't have to worry about our tension. The size of these loops is always going to be uniform because the pencil is doing hard work for us. So there we are, there's basically our last stitch, and now we simply withdraw our pencil for the last time, and there is our beautiful fluffy Traveller's Joy head. Really is an enchanting technique. Now I'm just going to finish off this area here, and we'll see how it looks like as a finished motif. So there we can see our finished motif. As you can see, it's just overlapping that little bit of stem that we worked right at the beginning. The core at the middle there is just peeping through the work itself, and the floating embroidery is giving us a lovely three-dimensional effect, even showing and throwing these shadows against the background material here. And now I'll be able to add further fronds and all kinds of things to create a lovely three-dimensional fantasy, really, using this lovely technique. So here is our piece completed. As you can see, I have indeed turned it into a little autumnal fantasy with some little stylized honeysuckle berries, some tendrils, but basically the star of the piece is, of course, our floating embroidery here. You can see how it falls back very naturally against the background fabric. I've picked out a sort of mauvey grey to create the Traveller's Joy in this particular instance, and we can use that same colourway to create different effects on different backgrounds and also for different types of picture. As I said, we can create a completely different effect on the heads of our Traveller's Joy by using exactly the same thread. This is a single strand of Piper's 90 denier floss, as we were using before, on a black background. The colour stands out differently, but the stitch is still exactly the same. As you can see, the Traveller's Joy down here and up here is just the way we worked it before. Up here, I've used that longer floating embroidery, and just on the centre here as we looked at quickly at the beginning of the video, a shorter version in the centre of the passion flower. And then we can move on to the way we could use it, say, in a landscape design. Now, you may have noticed in the previous two pieces we've looked at that in places the Traveller's Joy, the edges at least, have been worked over the top of elements of the design which are further in the background. And we can use that device particularly well when we come to working something like a landscape, where we want to continue to create the illusion of distance by building up one element on top of the other to create this really three-dimensional effect. And here again I've been using exactly the same thread in the same shade to create our Traveller's Joy. And once again it looks completely different because I've worked it with a slightly longer stitch. That is, I had a slightly fatter implement to hold the thread away from the background fabric, which has made it just that little bit fluffier. And in places, in particular right in the middle there, it's superimposed across the far distance, the water and the hills coming down to it. So I hope you've enjoyed this little explanation of floating embroidery. It's been something that I've had many requests to do, and I hope you'll join me again very soon. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and tick the box to allow notifications of when I post something new. And I shall hope to see you again soon. Bye.